Hey, welcome back to the lecture. So now in this lecture, let's see how static keyword can be used with functions. So now let's say we have two files, a main.c and file1.c. And now let's say I create one function in main.c. Now the function name may be, let's say, void change system clock. So now let's say this function takes the argument system clock from other functions. So don't worry, you'll learn more about functions later. So what this function does is it actually takes system clock value from other functions in this variable, and then it uses this variable to change the system clock. Let's just print system clock here. So now let me just print a message system clock, let's say change to. Let's print this value. So now let's say for main.c, this is very critical and very important function, and this function should not be called from other files. The developer who wrote this function wants only functions of main.c should call this function. So functions outside the file main.c should not call this function. But if you leave this function like this, so any function of the project can call this function and it can change the system clock and thus causing problem to the application. For example, in this case, we have file1.c and the function of the file1.c can call this function. So it can just call this function, no issues at all. So it can call with, let's say, 0. Let's say it wants to freeze the system clock. So this is perfectly fine. So all you need to do is just give the prototype of this function right over here and just call that function. You can even use the extern keyword here because you are actually calling a function which is implemented outside the scope of this file, right? So you can even use the extern with this function prototype. So, but extern is usually assumed here, so you need not to use the keyword extern actually. So it is assumed. So now this code works perfectly fine. So now if I run the code, what happens here? Here you can see that there are no errors, right? So file1.c simply called that function and it changed the system clock, which main.c doesn't want to happen, right? So if main.c wants to protect calling this function outside the scope of this file, then you have to use static keyword here. So this is a static function, or it's also called as a private function of the file main.c. So only functions of the main.c can call this function now. So no functions outside the scope of this file can call this function. All right, so let's try to compile. Let's see what happens. The compilation is not successful, right? So the compiler is saying that undefined reference made to this function. So the compiler is not letting file1.c to compile successfully. So that's an alert for the developer of file1.c to understand that he should not call change system clock function because it's a private function. That's how privacy is imposed in C. So that's about usage of static. In the next lecture, let's explore about another storage class specifier that is extern, and I will see you in the next lecture.